Have you ever wondered who your rulers were? Well, it's not Congress. There is another more fatal branch of government, the billionaire class. Mockingjay here, and I'm going to go ahead and read all their names so you know who to write when something goes wrong. John Abel, S. Daniel Abraham, Bill Ackman, Brian Acton, Jay Adair, Brett Adcock, Miriam Adelson, Sheldon Adelson, Robert Agostinelli, Dennis Albaugh, Leslie Alexander, businessman, Bill Alfand, Peter Alfand, Susan Alfand, Ted Alfand, Herbert Allen Jr., Paul Allen, Sam Altman, Frederick Lothrop Ames, John E. Anderson, Mark Andreessen, Leonore Annenberg, Wallace Annenberg, Walter Annenberg, Philip Anschutz, Mary Anselmo, Edmund Anson, Barbara Cox Anthony, George Argyros, Mickey Arison, Sherry Arison, Brian Armstrong, businessman, Roland E. Arnall, John D. Arnold, Neil Aronson, John Arrillaga, Bob Aram, Ben Ashkenazi, Cliff Asness, William F. Austin, Daneen Avara, Ashar Aziz. Thanks for listening. The list continues in another video, but to hear some poems and support workers' rights at the same time, please visit toddcombs.net. Think senators hold all the power? The real decision makers are the B-named billionaires, and I'm going to read every last one of them. Louis Bacon, Thomas H. Bailey, Steve Ballmer, Carol Jenkins Barnett, Ronald S. Barron, Ed Bass, Lee Bass, Perry Richardson Bass, Robert Bass, Sid Bass, Frank Batten, Andrew Beal, Riley P. Bechtel, Stephen Bechtel Jr., Ari Beldegrun, Rebecca Beldegrun, Mark Benioff, Clay Bennett, businessman, Gail Benson, Tom Benson, Carl Berg, Nicholas Berggruen, W.R. Berkeley, Scott Bessent, Jackie Bezos, Jeff Bezos, Miguel Bezos, Manoj Bhargava, Baiju Bhatt, Anil Busri, Albert Balicki, George Bishop, businessman, Sanjit Biswas, Leon Black, Sarah Blakely, Len Blavatnik, Nathan Blacharczyk, David Blitzer, Jay Bloom, Michael Bloomberg, Michael Blue, Neil Bloom, Ernie Bach Jr., Faik Bolkaya, David Bonderman, Franklin Otis Booth Jr., David G. Booth, Amar Bose, Karen Johnson Boyd, Sam Boyd, Tim Boyle, businessman, Norman Brayman, Charles Brandeis, Orlando Bravo, Donald Bren, Jim Breyer, Junior Bridgman, Sergey Brin, Eli Broad, Robert Brockman, Charles Bronfman, Edgar Bronfman Jr., J. Hyatt Brown, Peter Buck, restaurateur, Matthew Buxbaum, Jimmy Buffett, Warren Buffett, Chuck Bundrent, J. Christopher Birch, Doug Burgum, Ronald Burkle, Aaron Burr, Charles Butt. That's B in the books. Next up, C. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Behind every headline you read lurk C-named billionaires. Let's unveil their names now. John Calamos, Austin S. Cargill II, James R. Cargill II, James R. Cargill, Margaret Ann Cargill, Andrew Carnegie, Rick Caruso, Alan Kasdan, Steve Case, Bubba Cathy, Dan Cathy, S. Truett Cathy, John Katzimatidis, Safra Katz, Ann Cox Chambers, Herb Chambers, James Cox Chambers, Gerald Chan, Priscilla Chan, Du-Won Chang, Fred Chang, Charles Liang, Leon Charney, Jay Chaudhry, Andrew Chung, Peggy Chung, Brian Chesky, Ben Chestnut, John W. Childs, Yvonne Chouinard, Michael Chowdhury, Robert Citrone, A. James Clark, Chris Klein, Richard B. Cohen, Steve Cohen, businessman, Chase Coleman III, Rocco B. Camiso, Steve Conine, William E. Connor II, William E. Conway Jr., Carl Cook, Gail Cook, Scott Cook, Tim Cook, William Cook, entrepreneur, Phoebe Hearst, Cook, Leon Cooperman, David C. Copley, David Cotton, James Coulter, financier, Joe Kraft, James Crown, Lester Crown, Mark Cuban. C is done. Up next, D. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Dollars speak louder than votes. Here are all the D-surnamed billionaires pulling the strings. Daniel A. Daniello, Wiley Dye, Ray Dalio, Jack Dangermond, Arthur Danchik, David Hall, American businessman, Bill Davidson, businessman, Barbara Davis, Jim Davis, businessman, Marvin Davis, Ray Davis, businessman, Robert Addison Day, Fernando de Leon, businessman, Darwin Deason, Edward J. DeBartolo Jr., Robert H. Dedman Sr., Crystal DeHaan, John Paul DeJoria, William J. Delaney III, Michael Dell, Fred DeLuca, Bharat Desai, Betsy DeVos, Helen DeVos, Richard DeVos, Barry Diller, Sanford Diller, Jamie Dimon, Jamie Deenan, John Doerr, Charles Dolan, Dagmar Dolby, Ray Dolby, Jack Dorsey, Tim Draper, Stanley Druckenmiller, Glenn Dubin, James Duff, businessman, Thomas Duff, businessman, David Duffield, Robert Duggan, venture capitalist, Doris Duke, James Buchanan Duke, Dan Duncan, Scott Duncan, businessman, Tim Dunn, businessman. D is covered. Next, E. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Ever wonder who really writes the laws? Meet the E-named billionaires shaping our world. Joseph Edelman, Wes Edens, Richard J. Egan, Behdad Eghbali, Fred Ehrsam, Larry Ellison, Megan Ellison, Red Emerson, Henry Engelhart, Israel Englander, Charlie Ergen, Thomas Mellon Evans. E is wrapped. Coming soon. F. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Forget Congress. F surnamed billionaires are the ones calling the shots. Here's every last name. Richard Fairbank, Philip Falcone, Andy Fang, Alfonso Fangel Jr., Jose Fangel, John Farber, Jay Farner, Judith Faulkner, Chuck Feeney, Steve Feinberg, Kenneth Feld, Arash Ferdowsi, Frank Fertitta Jr., Frank Fertitta III, Lorenzo Fertitta, Tileman Fertitta, David Philo, Larry Fink, Paul Fireman, Donald Fisher, Doris F. Fisher, John Fisher, businessman, Kenneth Fisher, Robert J. Fisher, William S. Fisher, Thomas Flatley, J. Christopher Flowers, Gerald J. Ford, Adam Ferrugi, Theodore J. Forstman, Donald Foss, Jim France, Sidney Frank, Bill Franke, Melaine France, Melinda French Gates, Michelle Freeborg, Dan Friedkin, Thomas H. Friedkin, Larry Friedland, Robert Friedland, Donald Fries, Thomas F. Frist Jr., Philip Frost. F is finished. Up next, G. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Giant fortunes steer policy. Let's list all the G-named billionaires you need to know. Mario Gabelli, Ernest Gallo, Rakesh Gangwal, Valentin Gapontsev, Ernest Garcia II, Ernest Garcia III, Peter Gassner, Bill Gates, Edward Gaylord, Joe Gebbia, David Geffen, Alan Jerry, Ann Getty, Gordon Getty, J. Paul Getty, John Paul Getty Jr., Dan Gilbert, George N. Gillett Jr., Ann Gittinger, Avram Glazer, Brian Glazer, Joel Glazer, Malcolm Glazer, Robert B. Gorgon, Amy Goldman Fowler, Diane Goldman Kemper, Alan H. Goldman, Jane Goldman, real estate investor, Saul Goldman, William Goldring, businessman, Tom Golisano, Selena Gomez, Leslie Gonda, Louis Gonda, James Goodnight, Alec Gores, Tom Gores, David Gottesman, Noam Gottesman, Chris Goulandris, Antonio Gracias, Ryan Graves, businessman, Todd Graves, entrepreneur, Jonathan D. Gray, David Green, entrepreneur, Dolly Green, Jeff Green, businessman, Pincus Green, Joel Greenberg, businessman, Jeff Green, Joseph Grendis, Kenneth C. Griffin, Christian Groh, Bill H. Gross, Sue Gross, Ken Grossman, Vera Guerin, Lucy Guo, Tamara Gustafson. G is in the books. Next, H. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Hidden behind polished facades are H surnamed billionaires with immense clout. Let's name them. Mimi Haas, Peter E. Haas, Peter E. Haas Jr., Thomas B. Hagen, Donald J. Hall, Sr., Bruce Howell, Dorrance Hill Hamilton, Harold Ham, Don Hankey, John M. Harbert, Marguerite Harbert, Maggie Hardy, Joseph A. Hardy III, Josh Harris, businessman, Bill Haslam, Jimmy Haslam, Reed Hastings, Christian W. E. Haub, Carl Aravan Haub, Richard Hayne, Timothy Headington, George Randolph Hearst III, George Randolph Hearst Jr., Richard Hedreen, Warren Hellman, Harry Helmsley, Leona Helmsley, Diane Hendricks, Ken Hendricks, John W. Henry, Jeffrey Hildebrand, J. Tomlinson Hill, Larry Hillblum, Henry Hillman, Baron Hilton, David Hindawi, Orion Hindawi, Gerald D. Hines, Huang Q, Reed Hoffman, Robert Holding, Amos Hostetter Jr., Drew Houston, Ming Shi, Jensen Huang, Stanley Hubbard, B. Wayne Hughes, Howard Hughes, Wayne Huizenga, H. L. Hunt, John L. Hunt, Nelson Bunker Hunt, Ray Lee Hunt, William Herbert Hunt, John Huntsman Sr., Barbara Hutton. H is done. Next up, I. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Influence isn't elected, it's inherited. Here are the I-named billionaires running the show. Carl Icahn, Marion Ilitch, Mike Ilitch, E. Bronson Ingram II, Martha Rivers Ingram, Samuel Insull, Jim Irsay, Jared Isaacman, Justin Ishbia, Matt Ishbia. I is complete. Next, J. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Justice in America often bends to J surnamed billionaires. Let's see who they are. Jess Stone Street Jackson Jr., Brad Jacobs, businessman, Erwin M. Jacobs, Jeremy Jacobs, Michael Jaharis, Joe Jamail, Hamilton E. James, LeBron James, Thomas James, businessman, Jim Jannard, Jay-Z, Howard Jenkins, Steve Jobs, Helen Johnson Leipold, Winnie Johnson Marquardt, Abigail Johnson, Barbara Piasecka Johnson, Charles B. Johnson, Edward Johnson III, Herbert Fisk Johnson III, Imogene Powers Johnson, Robert L. Johnson, Rupert Johnson Jr., S. Curtis Johnson, Samuel Curtis Johnson Jr., Sheila Johnson, Willis Johnson, Woody Johnson, Jerry Jones, Paul Tudor Jones, Boris Jordan, Michael Jordan, George Joseph Insurer, Bill Joy, Steve Jurvetson. J is wrapped. Coming soon, K. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Know who really calls the shots? K-named billionaires hold the keys. Here's the full list. David Kabeler, Neil Kadisha, Sonny Khan, George Kaiser, Travis Kalanick, Min Kao, Thomas Kaplan, Andrew Karam, Kim Kardashian, George Carfunkel, Alex Karp, Stephen R. Karp, Bruce Karsh, Richard Kane, investor, Pauline McMillan, Kynath, Brad M. Kelly, Peter Kellogg, Ken Kendrick, Brendan Kennedy, businessman, James C. Kennedy, Kirk Kerkorian, Shahid Khan, Vinod Khosla, Amin Khoury, Osman Kabar, James Kim, American businessman, Michael Kim, businessman, Sidney Kimmel, Richard Kinder, Randall J. Kirk, Seth Klarman, John Klug, Alexander Knaster, Phil Knight, Bill Koch, businessman, Charles Koch, David Koch, Julia Koch, Jerome Kohlberg Jr., Herbert Kohler Jr., Omid Kordestani, Michael Kors, Bobby Kotick, Jan Koum, Bruce Kovner, Robert Kraft, Michael Krasny, businessman, Henry Kravis, John Crebiel Jr., Stan Kroenke, Dan Kurzius, Joshua Kushner. K is in the books. Next up, L. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, Visit toddcombs.net. Laws bend toward those with cash. Let's read every L surnamed billionaire shaping policy. Joe Lacob, Ben Lamb, Eddie Lampert, Ken Langone, Isaac Larian, Mark Lassery, Aaron Lauder, George Lauder, industrialist, Jane Lauder, Leonard Lauder, Ronald Lauder, William P. Lauder, Henry Laufer, Frank Lockian, Ralph Lauren, Sheldon Lavin, Steve Livin, businessman, Ty Lee, Thomas H. Lee, businessman, William B. Leeds, Eric Lefkowski, Richard Lefrak, Pablo Legorreta, Fred A. Lennon, Douglas Leone, Ted Leonsis, James Leprino, Al Lerner, Nancy Lerner, Norma Lerner, Randy Lerner, Ted Lerner, Max Levchin, Leon Levy, Peter B. Lewis, Rodney Lewis, Jay Lee, David Lichtenstein, Andrew C. Liebman, Marianne Cargill Liebman, Joe Lehman, Edward Linda, George Lindemann, Carl Lindner Jr., Leonard Litwin, Daniel S. Loeb, Kelly Loeffler, Jeffrey Lorberbaum, Mark Lohr, Gerard Louis Dreyfus, Herbert Lewis, Josephine Louis, Tom Love, Daniel Lubetzky, George Lucas, Fred Luddy, Daniel K. Ludwig, Jeffrey Lurie, Howard Lutnick. L is covered. Next M. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Meet the moguls whose last names start with M, the true titans of industry. William E. Macaulay, Harry B. Macklow, Cargill Macmillan Jr., Whitney Macmillan, Gary Magnus, John C. Malone, Mary Alice Dorrance Malone, George J. Maloof Jr., Moish Mana, Morton Mandel, Stephen Mandel, hedge fund manager, Alfred E. Mann, Joe Mansueto, Bernard Marcus, George M. Marcus, Roger Marino, Ann Winfor Marion, Howard Marks, investor, Donald B. Marin Sr., Pamela Mars Wright, Forrest Mars Jr., Forrest Mars Sr., Jacqueline Mars, John Franklin Mars, Marika Mars, Valerie Mars, Elaine Teddimer Marshall, John C. Martin, businessman, Jorge Mass, Manny Mashouf, Clay Mathiel, Craig McCaw, Aubrey McClendon, Red McCombs, Patrick Joseph McGovern, Andrew McKelvey, Jim McKelvey, Miguel McKelvey, Drayton McLean, Linda McMahon, Vince McMahon, Bob McNair, Janice McNair, C. Edward McVaney, Neil Mehta, Doug Meyer, Frederick Meyer, Hank Meyer, Matthew Mellon, Timothy Mellon, John Menard Jr., Paul Mirage, Dinah Merrill, Dean Metropolis, Jeffrey Michael, Gary K. Michelson, John S. Middleton, Lowell Milken, Michael Milken, Gail Miller, businesswoman, Robert Warren Miller, Howard Milstein, Paul Milstein, Philip L. Milstein, Seymour Milstein, George P. Mitchell, Ken Moelis, Tom Monahan, William Moncrief, Gordon Moore, Jim Moran, businessman, Arte Moreno, John Morgridge, Manuel Marone, Johnny Morris, businessman, H. Gary Morse, Dustin Moskovitz, Jerry Moyes, Angelo Mosolo, Charlie Munger, Lachlan Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch, David H. Murdoch, Bobby Murphy, Elon Musk. M is finished. Up next, N. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Not all power wears a suit. Here are the N-named billionaires pulling the strings. Marshall Naifi, Jom Najafi, Mark B. Nathanson, Ben Navarro, David Nazarian, Isaac Parviz Nazarian, Eunice Nazarian, Jonathan M. Nelson, Adam Noman, Gabe Newell, Donald Newhouse, Samuel Irving Newhouse Jr., Samuel Irving Newhouse Sr., Henry Nicholas, Peter Nicholas, businessman, Bruce Nordstrom. N is done. Next, O. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Oligarchs operate quietly. Let's unveil every O surnamed billionaire behind the scenes. Daniel Oak, Igor Olenikov, Pierre Omidyar, John Oringer, Bernard Osher, John Overdeck, Aaron Osman, Fatih Osman. O is wrapped, coming soon. P. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Power hides in plain sight. Here are all the P-named billionaires you've never heard of. David Packard, Larry Page, Max Palevsky, Chamath Palihapitiya, Jeffrey Palmer, real estate developer, William U. Parfit, Sean Parker, Blair Perry Oakton, Ganpat Patel, David C. Paul, Jay Paul, John Paulson, Richard Peary, Kim Pegula, Terry Pegula, Nelson Peltz, Roger Penske, Robert Pera, Raymond G. Perlman, Ronald Perlman, Jerry Parenchio, Jorge M. Perez, Thomas Perkins, businessman, Isaac Perlmutter, Ross Perot Jr., Tyler Perry, Thomas Peterfee, Peter G. Peterson, T. Boone Pickens, Jeffrey Picower, Marion Macmillan Pictet, Mark Pincus, Kevin Plank, Carl Poled, William J. Porvu, Lorene Powell Jobs, Conrad Priebes, Forrest Preston, Michael F. Price, Gary Prim, Eric Prince, Matthew Prince, Pritzker family, Anthony Pritzker, Daniel Pritzker, Donald Pritzker, Gigi Pritzker, J.B. Pritzker, Jay Pritzker, Jennifer Pritzker, John Pritzker, Karen Pritzker, Linda Pritzker, Nicholas J. Pritzker, Penny Pritzker, Robert Pritzker, Thomas Pritzker. P is covered. Next up, Q. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Plot twist. There are 0 U.S. billionaires whose last names start with Q. Even Star Trek's omnipotent Q couldn't beam one into the Forbes list. Looks like the only Q here is for questions. No quarter for these billionaires. Beam me up, Scotty. This Q space is officially empty. Real policy is written with money. Here are all the R-named billionaires authoring our fate. Carolyn Raphaelian, Stuart Rahr, Richard Rainwater, Raj Rajaratnam, Mitchell Rails, Stephen Rails, Vivek Ramaswamy, Jimmy Rain, Catherine Rayner, Sumner Redstone, Trevor Rees-Jones, businessman, Michael Reese, businessman, Andrea Raymond Chiardelli, Jerry Reinsdorf, Ira Rennert, Mike Rapole, Linda Resnick, Stuart Resnick, Tony Ressler, J. Christopher Reyes, Jude Reyes, Mark Rich, Sid W. Richardson, Joe Ricketts, Leandra Rizzuto, Larry Robbins, Brian L. Roberts, George R. Roberts, Julian Robertson, Arthur Rock, David Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, Richard Rockefeller, Katie Rodan, Gary Rollins, Randall Rollins, Jeffrey Rosen, businessman, Barry Rosenstein, Ed Roski Jr., Stephen M. Ross, Matthew Rossack, Stephen Roth, Jeffrey J. Rothschild, Alexander Rovt, Mark Rowan, Robert Rowling, David Rubenstein, Michael Rubin, businessman, Phil Ruffin, Austin Russell, entrepreneur. Pat Ryan, executive R, is finished. Up next, S. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Some billionaires start with S, and their fortunes shape every corner of society. Haim Saban, Chris Sacca, Sackler family, Joss Sackler, Raymond Sackler, John Saul, Henry Samueli, Sheryl Sandberg, Herbert Sandler, Marion Sandler, Richard Sands, businessman, Rob Sands, David R. Saperstein, Tamir Sapir, Harry Sargent III, Karthik Sarma, Fayez Seraphim, Steve Sarowitz, Bernard Saul II, Richard Mellon Scaife, Dwight Scharr, Leonard Schleifer, Eric Schmidt, Reinhold Schmieding, John Schnatter, Nicholas Schorsch, Jerome Schottenstein, Ruben Schroen, Howard Schultz, Richard M. Schultz, Lynn Schusterman, Charles R. Schwab, Alice Schwartz, Stephen A. Schwartzman, Mackenzie Scott, Walter Scott Jr., Thomas Secunda, Bar Asid, Jerry Seinfeld, Martin Selig, Niraj Shah, Evan Sharp, David E. Shaw, Brian Sheth, Scott Schleifer, Joe Schoen, Mark Schoen, Walter Shorenstein, Ellis Short, Ram Shriram, Eugene Schvidler, Thomas Siebel, David Siegel, computer scientist. Herbert J. Siegel, Ben Silberman, Robert F. X. Sillerman, Larry Silverstein, Harold Simmons, David Simon, CEO, Herb Simon, businessman, Norton Simon, Jim Simons, Nat Simons, Charles Simony, J.R. Simplot, Scott Simplot, Paul Singer, businessman, Jeffrey Skoll, Neil Smith, Bruton Smith, Frederick W. Smith, Robert F. Smith, investor, Ryan Smith, businessman, Vinnie Smith, Daniel Snyder, Lindsay Snyder, John A. Sobrato, Donald Soffer, Sheldon Solo, Gwendolyn Sondheim Meyer, Patrick Soon-Shiong, James Lavoy Sorensen, George Soros, Clemmy Spangler, Alex Spanos, John Sperling, Peter Sperling, Jerry Spire, Evan Spiegel, Steven Spielberg, Timothy A. Springer, Bruce Springsteen, Edward W. Stack, Ted Stanley, John W. Stanton, Axel Stowski, George Steinbrenner, Michael Steinhardt, Elton Bryson, Stevens Sr., Jackson T. Stevens, James T. Stevens, Warren Stevens, Donald Sterling, Shelley Sterling, Leonard N. Stern, Barry Sternlicht, Mark Stevens, venture capitalist, David Stewart, Tom Steyer, Bob Stiller, Harry Stein, businessman, Dean Stoker, William C. Stone, John Stryker, Pat Stryker, Rhonda Stryker, David Sun, businessman, Sun Hongbin, Sahat Sutarja, Jeff Sutton, real estate developer, Tim Sweeney, Henry Suica, Taylor Swift, Kevin Systrom, S is done. Next. T. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. The true titans of industry start with T. Let's read every T-named billionaire. Jeffrey Talpins, Tony Tamer, Stephen Tannenbaum, Stanley Tang, A. Alfred Taubman, Glenn Taylor, Jack C. Taylor, Margaretta Taylor, Vlad Tenev, David Tepper, Peter Thiel, James E. Thompson, James Tisch, Joan Tisch, Jonathan Tisch, Lawrence Tisch, Lori Tisch, Preston Robert Tisch, Wilma Tisch, Bruce E. Toll, Robert I. Toll, Alan Treffler, Kenny Trout, James Truchard, Donald Trump, Fred Trump, John Tu, Kenneth D. Tuckman, Thomas Tull, Cal Turner Jr., John H. Tyson. T is covered. Up next, U. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Underneath every headline you see are U-surnamed billionaires crafting the narrative. Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy, Richard and Elizabeth Uihlein, Jayshree Ulal. U is wrapped. Next, V. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Voices of extreme wealth begin with V. Here are the V-named billionaires calling the shots. Jay Van Andel, Hope Hill Van Buren, Alberto Villar, Vincent Viola, Don Voltaggio, Jay Van Andel, Hope Hill Van Buren, Alberto Villar, Vincent Viola, Don Voltaggio. V is finished. Up next, W. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. When you think power, think W-surnamed billionaires. Here's the complete list. Ramesh Wadhwani, Ted Waite, David Walentis, Walton family, Ann Walton Cronky, Nancy Walton Laurie, Alice Walton, Christy Walton, Jim Walton, Lucas Walton, S. Robson Walton, Sam Walton, Ronald G. Wanek, Todd R. Wanek, Roger Wang, William Wang, Travis Ward, Ty Warner, Kelsey Warren, Dennis Washington, Bruce Wasserstein, Sanford Artweil, Russell Weiner, Adam Weitzman, Herbert Wertheim, Kanye West, Les Wexner, Friedrich Weyerhaeuser, Dean White, businessman, Meg Whitman, Joel Wiener, Leonard Wilf, Mark Wilf, Ziggy Wilf, Dan and Ferris Wilkes, Arthur L. Williams Jr., Evan Williams, internet entrepreneur, Randa Williams, Robert G. Wilmers, Oprah Winfrey, Benjamin Winter, Danny Wirtz, Rocky Wirtz, Steve Witkoff, Anthony Wood, businessman, Nick Woodman, Cynthia Woods Mitchell, William Wrigley Jr., Skent, Ingrid Wu, Charles Wiley, Sam Wiley, Elaine Wynn, Steve Wynn, Amy Wiss. W is done. Next, X. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. X marks the spot for extreme wealth. Meet the X-named billionaires. Kenji, Tony Shu, X is wrapped. Coming soon. Y. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. You may not know their faces, but Y-named billionaires pull the levers of power. Jerry Yang, John Yarbrough, Jeff Yass, Denise DeBartolo York, Eric Yuen, Richard Uengling Jr. Y is in the books. Next up, Z. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net. Zero in on the zenith of wealth with Z-named billionaires. Here's the final roster. Charles Ziegler, Sam Zell, Ziff Brothers, Daniel M. Ziff, Dirk Edward Ziff, Robert D. Ziff, Anita Zucker, Jerry Zucker, businessman, Mark Zuckerberg, Mortimer Zuckerman. Z is complete. Thanks for watching the whole alphabet. To hear an audiobook advocating for workers' rights, visit toddcombs.net.